as you see from the logos, it's really a group effort, and I'm really pleased. It's a great group, so I'm really pleased to be part of it. I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction here, just a couple of slides, touching on some of our partners, and then diving into a little bit of background on the 2020 fire season, and then I'll turn it over to Ann Bradley to really get us started. So the Joint Fire Science Program supports fire science knowledge exchanges across the country. I'm sitting here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so I do a lot of work with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium, but you should, if you're not already connected with the Fire Science Exchange in your neck of the woods, please reach out and connect. You can just search Joint Fire Science Program exchanges and get the info for the local consortium in your neck of the woods. It's a really great opportunity to connect with other practitioners, share resources, learn new things, and it's really a bi-directional conversation, whether you see yourself as a researcher or practitioner or manager or policymaker. The conversation is going in both directions. So questions from the field going to researchers, ideas from policymakers getting bounced around, etc. And just one example of the kind of work these knowledge exchanges do, a recent report, working paper, I should say, from the Southwest Fire Science Consortium in partnership with Northern Arizona University on mitigating post-fire runoff and erosion in the Southwest. And maybe Barb, if you're willing, if you have a chance to put the link to that in the chat window. And again, thanks everyone for putting a little bit of background about yourself in the chat window. We also have a fact sheet that's a little more designed for the public, probably for most of the folks on this webinar. It's things you know, but might be a useful tool in communicating with others about some of the things we'll talk about today, things like what BEAR does. Another key partner today is the Burned Area Learning Network, and the Burned Area Learning Network is part of the Fire Learning Network and supported by the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Forest Service. And the mission of the Burned Area Learning Network is to work collectively to accelerate learning, share knowledge and practices to improve social and ecological outcomes following wildfire in a changing world. So right along the lines of what we're talking about today. And there's more information on the web about the Burned Area Learning Network. Lots of resources. When we could, pre-pandemic, we had some great field trips and learning opportunities out on the ground to really dig into the details of our post-fire world. The Burned Area Learning Network is really focused on integrating the short and long-term objectives for burned area management, because sometimes those fall in different places, as we'll talk more about today. Thinking about expanding the range of both immediate rehabilitation tools as well as long-term restoration options. Thinking about interagency and intra-agency relationships and this more cohesive response to the post-fire environment. And that's really why we pulled this webinar together today, to do exactly that. And so probably this is a good segue to move deeper into today's material. My name is Xander Evans, for those who've just joined. We have a couple new folks on, 120 people on the line. And I'm going to turn it over in just a minute or two to Ann Bradley from the Nature Conservancy, and she'll introduce the rest of the panelists. But it's a really great group, as I guess you probably saw in the reason you registered. So I wanted to just give a little bit of context for kind of how we're starting out thinking about 2020, the kind of year it was, and maybe giving us a little thought to 2021. I know sitting here in New Mexico is just dry as a bone. So looking at this chart of acres of wildfire in 2020 or in the past really makes me think about the coming fire season. And certainly last year was well above both the 10-year mean and the 5-year mean in terms of acres burned. Unfortunately, that's going to become more the norm based on the scientific research. Other ways of looking at 2020, many of you, this will be familiar, things like the national preparedness levels. When we look at the number of days that we as a nation were at either 3, 4, or 5, it's the greatest number of days in those categories of any year that I saw records for. And then there are other, you can look down below at the number of days at levels 4 and 5 or just 1 and 2. So I think this kind of tells us about the kind of season we had. And there obviously where fires burn, many of you live through this, so it'll be pretty visceral, but sometimes we forget our neighbors and what they went through as well. And there are, again, different ways of looking at it. This is just the sort of map of perimeters, but we can also look at where some of the type 1 teams were deployed. And there were a lot of fires, a lot of need for type 1 teams out there. California, Oregon, Arizona, and then later in the year, Colorado, really a lot going on. And of course, all those acres burned means that we're starting to talk about post-fire acres. Just some other charts on the number of wildfires and acres burned, breaking it down a little bit by region. And I'll just point out, many of you probably know these abbreviations from the National Coordinating Committee, but NO is Northern California and SO is Southern California. I had to look that up. And that's where we saw a lot of the acres burned in 2020. And then obviously today we're thinking about the sort of post-fire world. And so we wanted to just put up a few numbers thinking about what's the context for post-fire acres. And these numbers are for the Department of Interior. And I actually separated out the upper panel includes Bureau of Land Management, the lower panel excludes Bureau of Land Management, so you can see more clearly the other agencies. And so it highlights one that BLM is responsible for a lot of these post-fire acres. And even for national parks or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Bureau of Indian Affairs, those are not small numbers. They may be dwarfed by BLM, or we'll look at Forest Service in a second. But for those agencies, that's a lot of ground to cover, a lot of ground to worry about. And it's consistent. It's something that's not going away by any means. And I think this is my last slide, just looking at the national forest systems in particular. Some of the stats, you can probably read those faster than I can read them off, but there was a lot of work thinking about the post-fire environment. Bear assessments on almost 4 million acres. That's just a lot of work to get done. 124 funding requests. And then down below, we see the kinds of treatments that were rolled out. So clearly, this is a big part of the Forest Service's responsibility to National Forest System lands. And again, a motivator for today's conversation. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne, and I'll be in the background trying to help in the chat window if you have any questions or problems. Just a reminder, since a few more folks have joined, we will be recording this session and we'll make it available afterwards. And we will save some time for questions and answers at the end. But if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat window and our panelists may chime in and answer those as we go. Or we may hold and bring them out for more discussion towards the end. So with that, Anne, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for that great introduction to the issue. Xander mentioned my name is Anne Bradley, and I'm the Forest Program Director for the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico. And our forest program in New Mexico, it's really about preparing for fires, encouraging good fire on the ground, and in recent years, trying to figure out how we interact with the post-fire environment, because as Xander well pointed out, we've all been experiencing larger, more severe fires. They're coming more quickly, and and it's a piece of our fire work that really deserves attention. And I'm also part of the Burned Area Learning Network. And really, our objective really in having this session, as well as other activities that we do, it's trying to build those linkages. We know that all aspects of working on fire and landscapes is important. And a lot of times those of us that are practitioners in the field is we tend to get a little siloed into our respective areas. So we thought this might be a really great time to talk about how we build those bridges. So we're extremely pleased to have a very experienced and skilled panel, and I'd like to introduce them a little bit more to you here. First up, Kara Farr is the Forest Service National Bear Program Lead. And Kara spent about the last 20 years working across federal agencies in the US as the soil scientist, resource advisor, as well as a bear manager. Micah Keisho is one of her colleagues in the Forest Service, and I'm happy to say he's a neighbor here to me in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Micah's the Watershed and Bear Program Manager in Santa Fe, and he's got a good 12 years of experience in the Southwest, and we're looking forward to hearing more from him, especially around the issue of effectiveness of all those treatments that we're trying to put on the ground to mitigate problems. Rich Schwab is works for the National Park Service and is the Burned Area Emergency Response Coordinator at the national level. And as Rich says, and I'm of probably the generation Rich is, Rich says he's been deployed to many of the widely known wildfires of our generation. So yay, Rich, for the depth of your experience. Catherine Rowden is an important partner that some of us that work in land management don't always get a chance to think about until the emergency comes. And Catherine is the National Weather Service Hydrology Program Manager for the Western US and leads the Weather Service Post-Fire Hazards Working Group. So she's been working on the science end and been a co-lead for a number of state and private post-fire assessment teams. So she's got that on the ground knowledge. Mary Stuver is the Chama District Forester for New Mexico State Forestry. And the New Mexico, as well as a number of other states now, has been able to try to help their citizens by posting after wildfire information, helping folks navigate some of the challenges if their community suffers from wildfire and is concerned about the aftermath. So Mary runs that program in the New Mexico State Forestry. She also worked as a bear implementation leader for 5 years with the White Mountain Apache tribe after the 2002 Rodeo Chetasky fires. So we'll have a tribal perspective and a state perspective from Mary. And Mike Zipko, we're really pleased to have Mike. Mike is the executive director for the Wildland Fire Leadership Council at the national level. If you're not familiar with WFLC, it's an intergovernmental committee of federal, state, tribal, and local officials. It's convened by the Secretaries of Interior, Agriculture, Defense, and Homeland Security, and it's dedicated to consistent implementation of wildland fire policies, goals, and management activities. And poor Mike reports to both the Undersecretary of Agriculture and the Assistant Secretary of the Interior. And he has a past work history working for the Southern Governors Association and served as executive director for the Southern Group of State Foresters. So with that introduction, I'd like to get started. We're going to have a pretty dense conversation here. We'll try to go pretty quickly, and thematically, we're really going to be talking about some contrasts. And the first contrast we want to make, taking advantage of our panelists, is to really look at the difference between the wildfire suppression organization and operations and post-fire suppression or post-fire organizations and their operations, because they really are kind of different beasts, although they try to tackle two different kinds of emergencies. And so with that, I'm going to call first on Rich Schwab to help us start. And Rich, maybe you could help people, especially if they're fire folk, understand some of the key differences organizationally between fire and post-fire organization and operations.
Sure, thank you, Ann. Do you have the slide of the Thomas Fire? Xander? Okay, that's fine. So while many fires may be beneficial to the landscape and are necessary for ecosystem restoration, some fires create situations that need to be addressed. The Thomas Fire is an excellent case study in that regard. The fire started in December of 2017, and then there was a wedding rain on January 9th of 2018, and then on January 21st, there were mudslides and debris flows with 21 fatalities. So 2 people were killed during the fire itself, and then there were 21 people killed from post-fire events. And to me, this is astounding, because if you've ever been in that part of the country, you have dense population, you have serpentine roads, you have dense vegetation with wildland urban interface. And so credit goes to those local emergency authorities that did the evacuations. But the incident is not over when the fire goes out. We all must work together as a single government, an all-of-government response, because we are one government. I was told at a public meeting during the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico, Mary Stuver was there, that the public doesn't care about the color of money. They don't care if it's Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, state, what have you. What they want to know is their family's safe. Top line supervisors also don't care. They need somebody to explain to them how the instant command system works, what's their fiduciary responsibilities for emergency stabilization funding, because the emergency stabilization money is a subset of the fire suppression account. And they want to know how to resource order specialists and supplies and equipment. So we must all work together and have one response. We need to be able to confront the post-fire threats, because the incident is not over when the fire is contained. If you can show the next slide. Bear teams follow the same rules of the incident command system as fire does. They are scalable to address the values at risk. On this example here, you can see in the top picture, a bear team can be 1 or 2 people. And this guy's looking at he's standing on a boat dock and not in the middle of a burn patch. But the teams are scalable to address the values at risk. So in the lower picture, that's the bear team that was on the Woolsey fire, and it consisted of several disciplined groups, and groups is plural, because there were extreme threats to life and property. So on the next slide, the bear positions have recognized qualifications and standards that are established by interagency guides, just like fire. The personnel can be ordered as technical specialists. They can also be ordered as resource advisors, but primarily for bear teams, they're ordered as burn area emergency response specialists. We use the same dispatch systems, the same qualifications, the same qualifications database, and we fit within the incident command system. However, we recognize that there are gaps in cross-jurisdictional discrepancies on how we manage bear responses. And we're going to go into that. So back to you, Ann.
Thanks. Any of the other panelists have anything to enhance what Rich just shared?
Well, I would just add in one of our big differences between our fire organization and our bear organization is how we staff the organizations. For example, we have several staff that are set up with their primary purpose of their job is fire suppression versus our post-fire programs. Our post-fire programs are staffed by people who are doing this as a collateral duty onto their normal job. So we're looking at our soil scientists, our hydrologists, our engineers, even our regional coordinators are have a full-time job either as a meteorologist, and the post-fire is all a collateral duty. So we're not having that same sort of level to respond with the same intensity post-fire that we are responding with wildfire suppression.
Thanks, Kara. So speaking of just where the practitioners come from to actually respond, I'm wondering, Kara, could you talk a little bit more about the duties of the responders? What happens during the actual fire incident?
Absolutely. With that being a collateral duty for most of our positions, when a fire starts on a forest or a unit or a National Park Service unit, you'll have your coordinators who are there looking and watching, taking a look, seeing where the fire is burning, what values it's affected. They're doing the background work, starting to make phone calls to bring in and pull in and staff who we're going to need for those teams. So let's say we had that large team that Rich showed in the picture before. While that fire is just getting started and they're seeing all the values, we're going to start forming and making those pre-assessment judgments of how we're going to be able to respond on that fire, gathering that information so that when we do have the teams in place, they're able to do the assessment in a very quick fashion, typically a 7 to 10 day quick response to figure out what we're going to need to do to implement actions at that point. So all of that background work is getting done while we have the suppression activities ongoing out on the land.
How about public engagement for many of the panelists?
I can start. So a lot of times we'll try to have someone from the post-fire perspective show up and attend at least some of the public meetings to get that word out early. That's probably one of the places where we are not always as successful as we could be, is getting that word out early during the fire and the suppression activities, that you're not going to be able to just relax and breathe a sigh of everything is good when the fire is out, that there's still additional items that you need to be paying attention to. And I know that's a big part of what Catherine does.
Thanks, Kara. Yeah, so from the National Weather Service side, we're constantly trying to take opportunities to get that word out. Sometimes when the bear team is there, sometimes before they get there. You know, over the years, we've seen a lot of improvement in engaging with the suppression PIOs, and that really is helpful because that's just a whole machine that is not there once the fire is buttoned up. So it's just such a great tool to get that post-fire message out, and including us in those fire public meetings, you know, even a couple minutes at the end, just to raise that level of awareness about, you know, the continued emergency that's going to be there after the fire's gone.
Thank you. And since Catherine, you kind of gave us a little introduction to the work that you do in terms of public engagement, maybe for our audience, you could describe a little bit more about the role of the Weather Service.
Sure. So within the Weather Service mission for forecasts and public warnings, the post-fire flash flood and debris flow fall within that. So the role of the Weather Service is really trying to get as much information as early as possible as to what the threat is. And we really depend heavily on the work of the bear teams from the Forest Service and DOI, as well as the USGS debris flow group on telling us where the areas of most concern are. But there isn't always a federal bear team, and sometimes we need to be ready to warn before the bear teams get there. You know, if we have a fire during, you know, with the monsoon right behind it, or like Rich's example of Montecito and the Thomas fire. So a lot of times we are trying to interact with the suppression incident to, you know, maybe glean whatever information they have so we can prepare our warning program. We're often out there, you know, seeing what we can see, or partnering with the NRCS or local conservation districts, or, you know, any kind of emergency management personnel that aren't already completely consumed by suppression activities, and community support on that side. So, so just an awareness for those that work in that realm. If you're being pestered by Weather Service staff that are not incident meteorologists, that's why we're trying to get that information to spin up a flash flood warning program as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so, you know, one of the things that, as I'm located here, as I mentioned, in New Mexico, and so I've had the the advantage or disadvantage of watching our local mountains burn severely and had the subsequent flooding and so forth. And one of the things that we've really been thinking about, there's sort of the fire organization, there's the post-fire emergency response, but then there's this longer term, what comes next. And so I'm just wondering, from the perspective of a couple of panels, thinking about that timeline for response. And from your perspectives, how does the post-fire emergency response and recovery differ from wildfire responses? And I'm going to call on Micah first, since you're also kind of located in a particular landscape.
Same one as you, Ann. Thanks. I guess for the timeline for response, Xander put up a slide in the beginning, one of those new working papers that had a good timeline for assessment, where there's assessment, there's approvals, there's coordination, there's implementation, all that's going on at the same time. The two general categories when I think of post-fire response in terms of BEAR, it's two main parts, the assessment and implementation. Implementation doesn't always occur, and the assessment timeline, that's really dependent on the fire size, burn severity, critical values, and the time of year. I think some assessment timelines can be as short as a few days. For those low complexity fires, thinking back 40, maybe some low burn severity or very few critical values. And some assessment timelines can be as long as 2 weeks or even more for those higher complexity fires. I think that timing, in the Southwest is really important. So, the early season fires where you may have some time before the monsoons, maybe a little less urgency, even though it is an emergency. And same with the late season fires where you're kind of past your high risk season, monsoon season. You may have a little time to wait before you get in there. But those fires that are in June, mid to late June, when you're really pushing those monsoons, that's when you have the most urgency. You're trying to get in sooner to the fire area to start your assessment. And of course, that all depends on the fire activity and really the fire team's comfort level of sending folks in to start doing that assessment. And I think the important part, the real goal in BEAR is not completing the assessment, but identifying if there's a need to develop an emergency response strategy. So, if you go as far as the implementation, that timeline really focuses on getting treatments in place before the first damaging storm. But of course, that could be up to a year later. So I think, implementation timeline can be, again, as short as a few days, can be as long as a couple weeks, or even up to a year. But again, the goal is to get it in before that first damaging storm, because it is an emergency. I think even after the assessment and implementation, the risk really doesn't go away just after that first year. It all depends on recovery. I think what we've seen in northern Arizona with what folks are calling the monsoons, back-to-back very poor monsoon seasons. We're also seeing some very poor winter moisture here in New Mexico and across the Southwest. That really limits your recovery, and recovery is very important for how long those post-fire effects will last. And I think those last years out sometimes, even with some good recovery. So again, message, the risk really doesn't just go away after the 1 year.
Yeah, thanks. And before I turn to Mary for a different perspective, just from your handbook for the Forest Service and thinking about how treatments are funded and kind of the timeline that you mentioned, you have this kind of weeks to a year, and how far out can you actually be applying BEAR treatments in terms of time?
Well, so again, if we're applying treatments, it's really an emergency. So we should be, implementing those treatments as soon as possible. But, through our guidance, we have up to a year to implement those treatments. Or, if a treatment fails and we can get back in and fix that up so it's more effective the next time, we can do that. But it's all has to happen within that first year. Again, the focus is really on completing the treatments before that first damaging storm. So in the Southwest, if we're having a fire that's prior to the monsoon seasons, we're looking at implementing treatments prior to early July. If it's a late season fire, you know, we're really trying to implement treatments before the snow flies. But again, that high risk season is the next year's monsoon season.
Thank you. And Mary, just thinking about the conversations we've had about timeline for response and expected needs for treatment, wondered if maybe you could share some of your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I come at it from a perspective of communities, landowners, homeowners, and it's really a Hotel California experience. You know, you can check out anytime you like, but you really can never leave. Once you have these large burn scars on the landscape, you're looking at impacts and effects, and we haven't had them long enough on the landscape to really know definitively when we have reached that point of recovery of stabilizing our hydraulic system so that we have a good idea of what's normal again. So we had a flood off of a Ponil burn that killed a kid at Philmont Scout Ranch over a decade after the burn. So you can get events on these burn scars that still cause a lot of problems years and years later. And so when we talk about bear, we're really only looking at emergency stabilization. And when we talk about post-fire activities from a community standpoint, we're talking about more than emergency stabilization. We're talking about recovery and you know, being able to get back to, it may be a new normal, but getting back to a predictable kind of ecosystem that you're living in. So it can be quite different.
Thanks very much. And then for the final question in this segment, I'm wondering, you know, I mentioned earlier, sometimes we tend to get a little bit siloed in our specialty areas and people's lives and jobs are really busy. But I'm wondering if some of the panelists might like to kind of share what you'd particularly like, maybe the line officers or fire staff to know about post-fire response programs and what the differences are between maybe what they're used to and then the realm that you've spent most of your time.
So I'll jump in first again, and I'll echo some of the comments already made across the board. And the big one being that post-fire response really is a continuation of our fire response. It is not a separate action or a separate activity. We wouldn't be doing post-fire response work had there not been a fire. It is all one event. And we need to have that consideration going into our fire response that it's not over until we're getting through all of the emergency response actions. And that does involve having the training and having the preseason preparedness for post-fire that we do have for wildfire suppression. That's a need that we have to make sure that we have the staff available to work through the whole continuation of the fire starting to the fire going out to any events happening post and after.
Thanks. Other panelists?
And I'll go next. So when we're talking about line officers, what I would like them to know is that they need to be prepared and they need to know their responsibilities. And one of the great ideas I like to see implemented is that they host a preseason meeting with their fire staff, their law enforcement, and their natural resource specialists so that they can appoint leads for different functions on the bear team and bear responsibilities. And I also suggest that they game out a fire, either with a tabletop exercise or a sand table exercise, so that each person knows what their role is in the post-fire environment.
Yeah, and I'll add just a little bit there. You know, from my level, I see bear as kind of a less formal commitment than fire, and that's been touched on already here. And I think it's important for the line officers to know that some of your folks that serve in fire also serve on bear teams, and that's when that work-rest ratio comes into play. So you got to be aware of who you're putting out there and kind of what are the needs for bear, because, you know, maybe it's been said or it will be said, but the most important thing in Bear is a local and prepared team. If you can get your local specialists that know the ground, know the area, know the climate, you're going to have your best success there.
Thanks a lot, Micah. Well,
And
we're gonna
so,
go
can
ahead.
I add
Yes.
in, just, it's real important for line officers as well as incident management team participants to recognize that Bear applies on federal lands and not on the non-federal. And so there are, many times that the fire is burning across the boundary, or that the fire, is being responded to by an IMT, but it's completely a private land fire or something. And so you cannot promise that there will be a post-fire response, and it doesn't look like the post-fire response on federal lands. So a lot of times we are seeing line officers step forward and promise the public that the Bear team will be here when that doesn't exist.
Thanks. That's great segue, Mary, to the next section here. And so we've talked then just a bit about fire versus post-fire as terms of responsibilities and activities. And now kind of the other thing that a lot of us have been digging into is really the difference between the federal and non-federal land response, and then that non-federal versus tribal lands. And so Mary kind of gave us a great lead off. And so maybe let's dive in a little bit and talk about who's in charge and how is it initiated. And we'll start on the federal landscape, and maybe Kara, you can give us a little lead off on this.
Of course. So for the Forest Service side, our forest supervisors are the ones who are responsible for initiating a bear team. And we ask that every fire that is greater than 500 acres get at least an initial assessment. That initial assessment can be as simple as a soil scientist or hydrologist, whoever is that bear team lead for the forest, taking a look at the fire, seeing if there are values out there that we should be concerned about, and getting a sense of the burn severity. From there, that can grow. And again, it's very much a scalable team that can be put in place to do the more formal side of the assessment, where we're going out and mapping the soil burn severity. But that initial step is 500-acre fire. We will take a look at it as an agency and then determine whether or not a program or a team will be brought in according to our program. And it's a little bit different for the Department of Interior. So, Rich?
Sure. We follow a similar process. It's that park superintendent or that line officer, like a refuge manager, that has that responsibility for that initial call. And within the National Park Service, the parks work very closely with the regional bear coordinators to help staff the team. And then if they're getting overwhelmed, they can resource order folks in either from neighboring parks or within the region. And then we also staff a National Department of Interior bear team. And they can go out as a team, or we can individually resource specialists from that roster.
Yeah, I noticed in the chat that we have quite a few folks from BLM on the session today, so that DOI information is important. Yeah, so Mary, you've kind of already put the marker down and said it ain't the same on non-federal lands, and so who is in charge?
So Xander, do you have those two slides, and can you show the one on federal lands? So when we're dealing with federal and tribal lands, generally the jurisdiction is really clear, and it's the same jurisdiction of who's responding to the post-fire as who's responding to the fire. And there's not a lot of money, but there is some specific money that's been allocated to the post-fire program. And so you have the same agency. If we can go to the next slide. With state and private lands, there is generally no clear jurisdiction. There are multiple agencies at various government levels that have some partial responsibility. And there isn't a specific post-fire funding, but there are programs that have been tacked on to existing funding programs and existing mechanisms. And so the money to respond to post-fire is kind of all over the map with multiple different agencies and programs. And so it's a real trick to figure out where you can go get help and what you can get help for from whom. So no single agency bears the responsibility across these multiple ownerships. And, you know, the disciplines are really varied. And so it is a challenge, is an understatement, to put together a post-fire response when there's not federal land, when it's not on federal land.
Yeah, I was thinking, and I think Mike Zipko will get into this a little later, but there's not only not clarity about who's in charge, but maybe the timing and when the funding might be available on the private side, and the state side might be different than it is the immediate response, I'm assuming, on the Fed side.
Yeah, we're really encouraging communities to think about post-fire way before the fire ever happens, and to identify where funding is available, but also if their structure allows to put away a budget to deal with this type of thing. Because as Kara mentioned, a lot of times our, you know, monsoon is right on the heels of our fire, and communities don't have time to apply for this type of funding and wait for decisions that could be months in the making. They may need to be out taking some immediate action within days of being cleared to go out on that fire. And so there are definitely, it's on the shoulders of communities to really be prepared for these post-fire emergencies. And so that's a message that we're trying to get out to emergency managers, is don't wait to have a wildfire. You need this kind of planning up front.
Thanks. And Catherine, did you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I was just going to talk about the trigger for a non-federal post-fire response, and it's all across the map. I think, you know, like Mary's saying, it's a lot of times it's just the community really speaking up and saying they need help that starts pulling the different threads, and somebody maybe has done it somewhere else and they start sharing, you know. So it really happens when people start really talking about it and asking for support. And it doesn't always happen, because sometimes there's no support or money, but when I've seen it happen, it's usually because the locals are really speaking up.
Thank you. So just thinking about this federal versus non-federal response, I know that there are some limits for federal experts to be able to work off of the federal landscape. And I'm wondering if our panelists could talk about that a little bit, because a lot of times, you know, the federal experts are available, they're doing their assessment, and sometimes communities ask, well, you know, why can't you do that off of the forest or off of the park?
Okay, I'll go first on that one. So in fire, they do have cross-jurisdictional agreements and joint power agreements on who's going to respond to a fire and who has the various responsibilities. And then they go into a unified command. We are lacking that in post-fire. And there are a lot of questions about that. And some of them have to do with liability and spending authority, using federal funds on non-federal property, whether or not we have the authority to do that in budget bills and other legislative frameworks. And this has caught the attention of the Western Governors Association and also WFLIC. So Mike's going to be talking about that here near the end of the session. But one of the things that we are working on is sharing our post-fire spatial imagery. This is one of the most demanded products, the most requested products that a BEAR team produces. And obviously the feds like to take ownership of that product and take the lead as far as ground truthing it and doing the field verification. And we don't like to release that until the final soil burn severity map is produced. But we are taking a concerted effort to work with our cooperators to share that information during the time of the incident and with those local emergency response authorities. And we're trying to work on a process for communities like Mary is describing to be able to order their own products when there's not a federal nexus.
Thanks. How about the other panelists? Any other thoughts?
I would just add in one of the other concerns that we have is that there is somewhat of a personal liability concern when we have federal land management employees making risk assessments and treatment recommendations for values that are outside of our jurisdiction. So that really comes back to the shoulders of the employees who are doing that. There is not a level of agency protection for our land management employees to make those types of recommendations. So we're very careful about how to work through that. But I'm going to throw a little segue into part of this and responding to Christy's question is there FEMA funds available post-fire? And that also helps not only on work post-fire on private lands, but also with the assessments that can be done on private and state lands. And Catherine and I were involved with a FEMA-funded effort in Western Oregon this year to look at the assessments on state and private lands. And we had our federal land management personnel involved to help train other governments, both local, state, and other federal agencies who had private land and state land jurisdictions on how to do the risk assessment that we do post-fire. I don't know, Catherine, if you had more to add on that.
Yeah, so the Weather Service has, we do have a few people that do bear hydrology and whatnot, so kind of have a foot in both worlds. And we don't have that same, you know, we're not land management, we're not constrained to one land, we have to warn on all lands. So there is that flexibility there. But like Kara was saying, at least in FEMA Region 10, there's been that model that's been piloted a couple of times now of utilizing the expertise from the federal bear teams to train those people, like Kara said, have jurisdiction on state and private land. And that happened in Washington in 2014, and that exercise is still paying off to this day. There was a soil scientist who works for State Department who helped on a fire this summer, who was a recipient of that training. So there's some really great avenues there to support communities still.
Thanks.
And if I can like pitch in here, a lot of times our connection to the FEMA funding is through our State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And in 2018, with the Ute Park fire that was primarily on Philmont Scout Ranch in northern New Mexico, the Homeland Security Department had an existing grant of FEMA funds, and they were allowed to reprogram some of the funds in that grant in order to pay for a private consulting company to come in and do a bear assessment, a post-fire assessment. So we were able to channel some FEMA money to do that type of stuff. But they were very clear that this isn't a program that's always here. This kind of money isn't always around. This is not the fix yet to this problem. This is how we can deal with this one fire. And so it seems to me that right now, every fire that is dealing with non-federal lands in terms of burn response is its own show, and you're dealing with a very complicated plate of money from NRCS with emergency watershed, but don't start anything until you're approved and count on months before you get approved, to working with the Silver Jackets, working with the Farm Service, working with all kinds of different organizations out there. And a lot of times the best responses that we've seen, the city of Raton did a fantastic response on the track fire in 2011, because they just took the bull by the horns and started putting their own equipment out in the watershed, doing watershed protection things right before the first monsoons came, and pretty much saved their water supply. So it's a time for communities to shine, to step up and really take leadership.
Okay, we had a quick question in the chat for those who might not know the Silver Jackets program. I was wondering if maybe you could just quickly explain who they are.
I might not be the best person for that, but they're through the Army Corps of Engineers, and there is a funding mechanism, and there are some staff members that are working with the Silver Jackets, but there's a lot of volunteers involved as well. and they deal with all kinds of emergencies, and they've really developed some good response when it comes to post-fire.
Thanks. And Xander just put a link into the Silver Jackets.
Sweet. Yeah, go there.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on a little bit here. And so we're out there either on federal, non-federal lands trying to do our best work to mitigate the potential danger to communities and property. And so there's been a lot of conversation about how effective are the mitigations that we put in place. And I'd like to turn to Micah as somebody who's been doing some practical thinking about this.
Familiar with the way you talk.
And so Micah, what are the limits to our understanding? What do we know about what works, what doesn't right now?
So Xander, this might be a perfect time to throw back up that ERI working paper. I think that's pretty recent. Over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a lot of great research done on post-fire hill slope treatments, research and just treatment effectiveness monitoring. And this working paper, the ERI working paper you saw in the beginning, summarizes some of that information. I think it's specific to the Southwest, but they also have a great fact sheet along with this as well. The paper provides some insight as to what conditions treatments perform better under, and some of the associated risks with those treatments. So to highlight a few, wood mulch and straw mulch. Wood mulch, most effective at reducing those sediment yields, followed by straw mulch. Wood mulch lasts longer on the site, at least compared to straw mulch, and it's more expensive. Straw mulch is less expensive, doesn't last as long on the site, and it has a higher potential to introduce non-native species. And I think it's important to note that's even true with the certified weed-free straw mulch. There's a lot that can happen for introducing non-natives, from harvesting that straw mulch to putting that straw mulch out as a treatment. So I think it's really important to discuss the pros and cons and the associated risks with any treatment we do. Some of the things that don't work as well, hydro mulch and contoured felled logs or log erosion barriers, not as effective. And I guess I'll back up just a little bit too and kind of explain the different levels of monitoring. So there's level 1 monitoring, which is more qualitative, most common type of bear monitoring. Level 2 monitoring is more quantitative, kind of confirming overall effectiveness at a forest or regional scale. And then level 3 is quantitative as well, uses rigorous design and protocols, and more getting at effectiveness at a national scale. And I think all produce very useful information just at those different scales. And I think what's important is to have some of this information right in your own backyard, because each fire is different, the time of year is different, the treatment, just how it's applied, is different. So having this data, whether it's level 1, 2, or 3 in your own backyard, can tell you a lot. And, as an example, I've done a lot of level 1 and level 2 treatment effectiveness monitoring, and 2 come to mind. The Wallow Fire of 2011, I didn't do the monitoring, but that had some level 3 monitoring done on it for post-fire seeding. And what that study found was that post-fire seeding may not be effective at reducing sediment yields. So Wallow Fire, Apache Sitgraves National Forest, kind of southeastern Arizona. Fast forward a few years to 2014 on the Signal Fire in the Gila National Forest, southwestern New Mexico, kind of neighbors there. We did some level 2 monitoring, and data from there actually showed seeding to be effective at reducing sediment yields even within that first year. And there's some insight into this. What we saw on the level 2 monitoring was, highly dependent on the timing of seeding and the precipitation events. We were able to get the seed down just on the onset of the monsoons. We didn't see any high intensity storms or, that dropped a lot of rain until September. So we're thinking that grass actually got to germinate, establish some roots, and held in place for those high intensity storms. So again, I think the main point is trying to get some information for your own backyard is important, and then also discussing those pros and cons and risks with any treatment.
And do the decisions get that get made and the choices that get made, are they documented when you do your monitoring so that there's kind of a track for people to follow to understand why certain choices are made?
Yeah, so choices as far as actually the treatment implementation.
Yeah, why, like I was just thinking as far as like, that might be something to look forward to. It's like, how can we help practitioners learn more effectively from each other? How, whether that kind of documentation is done anywhere.
Yeah, and I mean, at least for the treatment effectiveness monitoring, if you put in for funding through Bayer, they expect a report from you, and then that's some valuable information. Again, whether it's level 1, 2, or 3, there is some decisions, and upfront in the assessment, we document, why we're doing what on the ground, and treatments follow, or they must be. They have a couple variables, so they got to be proven effective. They have to substantially reduce risk in that first year. The treatments that we put on the ground must be considered the minimal action needed to reduce the unacceptable risk, economically justified, and of course completed before that first damaging storm. And we document that through the Bayer assessment, how and why we can do that, or if we can't, we don't recommend it in the first place.
Thank you. So like, we think about the treatments as being something that are assisting communities and keep them safe. And then there's ecological recovery. And I'm wondering do you think about treatments differently for those two kinds of purposes?
So, I guess what I'll say there is treatments under Bayer have one common theme. They're all recommended to mitigate that unacceptable risk. And unacceptable risk is a key couple words there. So we evaluate all critical values using the Bayer risk matrix, and that's a risk assessment tool. So when the risk is determined to be very high, or in the case of life and safety, intermediate risk, we start the evaluation process for response strategies or treatment options. And so the preferred Bayer response is natural recovery. But when that unacceptable risk cannot be mitigated by natural recovery, we look at closures and warnings next, and then finally treatments. And as I said before, those treatments have those 4 or 5 things that we have to prove, they're effective, can be implemented before the first damaging storm, and a couple other things I had said before, prior to getting them down on the ground. So I think the answer to the question is, whether it's life or safety, or soil productivity or hydrologic function, it is the same process that gets us to the discussion of a response strategy. And I think here, it's important to note that just because we implement treatments on the ground doesn't mean we eliminate all risk, right? We mitigate the risk. We maybe take that risk from an unacceptable level to an acceptable level of risk. But I think it's a good word to spread that risk doesn't go away completely no matter what we do.
Thank you. So, as the panelists were preparing for this session, we talked about the kind of nuts and bolts of effectiveness monitoring that, Mike had just laid out. But there's also, as folks who work in fire know too, that the social science is really important to understand better. Why do communities choose to make the choices that they do? How do we help them be better prepared for these kinds of fire and post-fire events? And so we thought we'd just take a minute and highlight some of the social science needs to evaluate effectiveness of our work with the public and communities. And I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and Kara for that comment.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it first. So in the Weather Service, our warning program is so intricately involved with social science. If people don't take action on a warning, then it kind of doesn't matter what we do. So in the post-fire environment, it's been evolving a lot. We've gotten better at predicting some of these events, especially with the work that the USGS Free Flow group has done on, advancing that science. But we're still seeing that people aren't heeding evacuation orders. There was just an event in California where 98% of the people that were told to evacuate ahead of a storm below a brand new burn scar did not. And fortunately, they were okay, but had something gone slightly different, they may not have been. And, and I think tying it to the folks on this call who are part of, suppression and whatnot, having that messaging start with that kind of infrastructure, the fire and the PIOs, and raising that level of awareness. Like, you can't just go home and tune out and everything's going to be okay once the fire is gone. I mean, the consistent messaging across all agencies from all, kind of trusted sources, really, based on what the social scientists have told us, really helps get that message across and help prompt action. It's one of many pieces, but that does help. Kara?
And one of the other additions to that I would say that we do struggle with is, as land management agencies, we very much have an action bias. When we know there is a risk out there, there's a lot of times where people want to do something about that risk. But a lot of these post-fire events with flooding and debris flow, we can throw as much money at trying to mitigate that risk as we want to out on the ground, and do very little to change that risk level and that potential for a damaging event happening. So there's times where we do throw money knowing that we're not going to substantially reduce the risk, just to show up and be, a positive member who's doing something on the ground to try to make it better. And at times that can sometimes reduce the level of attention people are paying to those warnings and alerts that are happening after. So we put a lot of action on the ground. We know those events are still going to happen, but there's a process that goes in of, but they did something about it, so we're safe. And we want to avoid those situations where we're creating a false sense of security, that people are protected from situations and events that we cannot do much to change.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, Kara, that going back to, you partnering with the incident on the messaging, that really helps, but also not selling it like, the bear team is coming, assuming they are, they're gonna fix it. Like, I don't think anybody ever says that outright, but sometimes that's the impression that comes across is, it's okay, here comes the bear team. And it does lend to that false sense of security. And it's such an uncertain environment.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm going to turn here for a moment. We talked a little bit about pre-planning and preparation for the post-fire event, even during the fire, before the fire happens. And so I wanted to invite a couple of our panelists to give some examples of things that they thought were successful for that pre-planning part of the post-fire response. And I'm going to turn back to you, Micah, for a moment.
Yeah, so one of the recent examples that come to mind, Xander, I think I gave you a slide of Northern Arizona, Coconino County, post-wildfire flooding assessment, if you can put that up. So in 2017, Coconino County, FEMA, some other partners got some funding to do a countywide assessment to identify key areas to focus a post-wildfire flooding assessment on. Results from the study were supposed to help local land managers and communities. There's the study if you guys want to reference, to help develop appropriate emergency response actions. And that could be before, during, or after a wildfire. So you fast forward 2 years to 2019, and the museum fire happened. And the museum fire happened right in the middle of where one of these priority areas that they focused in further on. And so during the bear assessment, this information was used. We actually brought in those county contractors that helped do the analysis and modeling with this. We shared that soil burn severity mapping data that we had done with them, and they were able to tweak and adjust their analysis to the current post-fire conditions. And really what that did was instantly it gave the local governments on the other side of the fence, on the private and non-Forest Service lands, something solid to help plan and develop emergency response actions. So at the same time, the Forest Service Bear team was wrapping up their assessment. Off forest lands, they had an assessment to work off of too.
Thank you. And there was a request for a link, so I hope someone can can assist with putting that link in. And I want to step back a minute. We did have a comment from Heidi too on the effectiveness, that the number of seeds per unit of application is really important in terms of some practical mitigation.
Most definitely, Heidi. Yep.
Thanks. So Mary, I'm going to turn to you for a second example of pre-planning.
Yeah, and if Xander, you can go back to the slide for the after wildfire website. So in New Mexico several years ago, we put together a multi-agency collaborative effort to try to make some order out of chaos in terms of all of the different programs that are out there and funding programs that are out there and stuff. And we came up with this after wildfire nm.org website, which gets hits from around the world and always has more people hitting this website from outside of New Mexico than within New Mexico, even in our big fire years. But one of the things that we found in the first year after we put the website together was, guess what? Folks who have been affected by wildfire have lost their internet connection. And so we came out with a print version to summarize some of the information that's on the website. But the website is one of those sites that you just keep drilling, and there's more and more information. Now we are working with our counties and communities who are developing community wildfire protection plans and are coming back around to revise their community wildfire protection plans. And we're encouraging them to do some post-fire planning in the CWPP and to identify a lot of things. And this website, again, becomes a very handy source of information to help them understand the kinds of problems that they may run into. And like Micah said, every fire is different and every response is different. And so you can't write the post-fire response plan, but you can do a lot of pre-planning in terms of knowing what you need to know going into a fire situation and where you can find the information that you need. I think there's one more slide, Xander. And this is the sections that are in our after fire website. So you can see that there is a lot of information, and we've written the website and the materials for two audiences. And one is for the individual response, the landowner, the homeowner who's been affected by fires, but the other one is the community response, the counties and the villages and the towns that have been impacted by a fire, and how to get prepared for that and where they can find resources.
Thanks. Any other panelists have any other things they'd like to add to this for a moment?
Got one last thing on pre-planning and on the federal side. And I like the idea of having a checklist for that agency line officer. And in the National Park Service, the superintendents have what's called the superintendent's desk reference. And we need a page in there talking about post-fire as far as bear. And the items that you might want to include are, what are the geospatial layers that are available, such as what are the downstream values at risk, and are they going to be available off-site in case that headquarters is evacuated? Who are the resource specialists that you have within your park that can address post-fire concerns, and who are your cooperators and neighboring jurisdictions? And you need to start building those relationships with those people. And I think that's a good segue to the next segment.
Thank you very much, Rich. So next up, we're going to talk some about what's been transpiring at the national level. And we're happy to have Mike Zupko share some of the work that the WFLIC and the WGA have been undertaking. And we mentioned you several times, Mike, so we're expecting you to tell us all kinds of stuff.
All right, thanks, Ann. No pressure, huh? No, I'll start off by saying that I'm very honored to be on with these various panelists, and quite frankly, many of the folks I've seen that are participants here. Troy Timmons with Western Governors and I have been collectively trying to corral and learn about this issue for the past couple of years, and many of y'all I've become friends with virtually, but even more than that, I've learned a lot from, and hopefully what we're working collectively together, and it may be under a WFLIC WGA banner, but we're all in this together. We've got this thing pointed in some really good directions that we're really excited about. So again, I'm just honored to be a part of it, and hopefully share some information here. Xander, you can go to the next slide, please. I won't go through all these pieces, but I do just want to say, again, over the past 18 months to two years, there's been multiple engagement points that we've been trying to facilitate. We've been trying to plug in a lot of these existing activities, both at the state level and at the region level. We've facilitated some forums. We've done a lot of work group meetings to where we're trying to hear where are these gaps and where are these opportunities that folks really see. And from where I sit, and as Ann described, who the members of WFLIC are at the beginning, we've been able to message a lot of that up. We've been able to talk to leadership at the federal, state, tribal, and local level to hear kind of what they're hearing from their side on an operational piece, but collectively, where do they see that responsibility falling and where those gaps are? How can we help to fill those? So it's been a really unique, I don't want to call it a journey quite, but it's been a really unique process to do that both up the chain and down the chain, and really learning from what many of you learn or know on the ground. So next slide. One of the things that I wanted to talk about for framing is this post-fire roadmap. Now, I'll be the first to say, I've learned a lot of states have some really good resources out there. A lot of, federal and state agencies have some really good places where they've pulled information together. What we're trying to look at here with kind of this national roadmap is some type of consolidated piece that really gets to everything that's out there available. What do communities have access to? This gets to one of the things that Ann keyed up a little bit earlier. What's the funding availability, not just post-fire, but pre-fire? What's the timelines that go with that? What's the science that you need to have packaged to apply for some of those things? And what's the disparity that you have even between some programs? If you apply to one program, you may not be able to get access to another. And so trying to play all those things out in this kind of roadmap. The next slide kind of shows this, this is just a snapshot, but the way that we really thought about this is in 4 quadrants. You have those things on the left that are the pre-fire, those things on the right are post-fire, above the lines federal land, and below the line is non-federal land. Again, this is we just threw up a handful of programs that folks know. There's actually been a spreadsheet put together that had over 100, and I can say, because I saw she's on here, I'll make sure I call her out, but Ellen Bergeron is working through a lot of this to help pull together some similar components that will fit into this roadmap. So again, we don't see this as a static document. We see this as a living document that hopefully, probably best played out online to be able to fit a lot of this together, add in best practices, add in science information, add in additional links. And that's what we're working towards on this roadmap. Now, if we've talked about this roadmap, you can click it to the next slide. The thing that's come to light again, it's not Troy and I not having this idea necessarily, but it's those of y'all that work in this space saying at the community level, there really is this need for a navigator. Somebody that can work closely with the community, that can hold their hand, that can tell the community, quite frankly, what they don't know. And as the seminar or the conversation today has really focused on some of the differences between wildfire response and post-fire response, a lot of it's in that transition. I think you heard from many of these folks talk about that. It's that transition. It's some things are connected, but some things are disconnected. And you take that to a community level, especially a really small community, but it's not just the small communities, but especially in the small communities, they've probably not been through it. They may have one part-time emergency manager. They may have one person they most definitely have one person wearing multiple hats. So how can we help fill that void at that community level? And this navigator concept is one that's kind of bubbled up or probably been out there, but we are helping to refine. I will say that we've been able to kind of push this out in a couple of states, push the concept out, in a couple of states late last fall. We were probably a little bit too late. in the fire year to have it take hold, but there is strong interest from multiple groups in trying to facilitate that. One piece I'll say with this navigator that we do see it being a non-federal individual, or could be a collection of individuals, but having some flexibilities that you may not have within the federal system. We have not identified a secret pot of funds to do this, so that's part of it as we explore how this plays out. We don't have a set of funds that we can just apply to this. There could be multiple models, and there could be multiple models or different approaches in different states or in different regions. So there's flexibility kind of built into this concept, but kind of what you see on the screen is how we see it interacting with some of the core pieces that are already in place. So Xander, I think you can head to I think it's the last slide. But again, I just wanted to kind of tee that up and say, again, this navigator piece really can be a core piece to fill some of this void. We've worked on some other components of it with the transition from, fire response to post-fire response and bear teams to what the community's left with after that. But happy to engage in some questions and further conversation.
Thanks, Mike. So that's a great segue to our next session, which is really the questions and that any of you have for really any of what you've heard today. And Xander, I don't know, what's your preference? Do you like people to put the questions in the chat so everybody can see them, or how should we go about this?
I think if people are more comfortable unmuting, I think most folks are pretty facile these days with Zoom and unmuting and muting themselves. But you're also welcome to just put them in chat. It's really whatever works best for folks. And let's see.
Looks like we got one question for you, Mike.
Thanks, Barb. Clarification, you're talking about the EO that was put out at the end of the previous administration?
Correct, which is why.
Okay. Thanks. I just want to make sure. There's been a lot more EOs since then, but none that hit on that specifically. So you're correct. The current administration is looking at that EO that was talking about how, I guess, efficiency in federal government and the various components of primarily the wildfire response piece of it. I will say I've had a couple conversations with some of the administration folks coming in. You're correct, they are looking at it. They are considering the components of it that they want to pursue. I think other folks have probably seen proposals from the Biden administration around something like a wildfire commission or some different ways to approach this. So I think that can be a piece of it, Barb. I don't think they've gotten to that level of specificity at all. But we're hopeful that as we talk about the various pieces of wildland fire, from pre-fire mitigation opportunities to active fire and suppression and to post-fire work, that we can insert some of these conversations in there. So good thought.
And I see Elijah has raised his hand, so we'll go ahead and speak up.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a question. My name's Eli. I'm at the Goddard Space Flight Center. I had a question that is on a little bit more technical side for any of the BEARS people. I understand you guys normally assess burn severity on a larger scale with Landsat, and I know that there's sometimes a challenge in getting a cloud-free day, especially because it takes a few weeks to normally acquire images. I'm curious if you guys have been able to use any of the MODIS or the VIIRS sensors for looking at burn severity, and if there is a strong enough correlation with what you guys see on the ground that you're able to have some confidence in what it's saying as you wait for higher resolution imagery.
So, Rich, do you want me to take the first stab?
Yeah, please.
So we use Landsat and Sentinel primarily as our two satellites that we're using to create the BARC maps. And it's because of the spectral, I'm not going to get my words right, the spectral waves that we have that we use to get the pre-fire and post-fire image. Some of the other satellites that don't have that same wavelengths that we're looking for, we have not been using, but both the GTAC organization, the Geospatial Technology and Application Center for the Forest Service, and USGS's AROS Center, and I don't know what that means, so you'll have to help me on that, Rich, what the AROS acronym is for, have been looking at a lot of different opportunities to use additional satellite imagery to inform those post-fire products. But they're constantly looking at it and trying to figure out what else we can use. The Sentinel itself has gotten our passes down to, I think, a 3 to 4 day window between satellite passes. So we do have a lot more opportunities there.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but Landsat imagery is 30-meter pixels. And for the work that we're doing to produce the burn severity map, that's usually sufficient enough. Now, you're bringing up the question on penetrating clouds and the overpass time and stuff like that. And like Kara said, that they're looking at that through USGS AROS and the Forest Service GTAC Center. And we're also working with NASA Satellite Needs Working Group on the next generation of platforms. And they're very interested in helping the fire community to do that. And you were talking about VIIRS and other platforms, but it does go back to what Kara was saying as far as what sensors are on there, so that we can do a differential analysis between the pre-fire image and post-fire image to give us that burn severity map. So send us an email. We can have a deeper, more deeper conversation on that.
Great, thank you. That good to get into some of the details. There's another question from Cedar that came in, and Cedar asks, does anyone know of any research investigating the effectiveness of water barring fire line and other alternatives which may be equally or more effective? Anybody got a line on that?
Kara, do you know if Pete Robichaux's ever done any research on that?
You know, I'm not aware if Pete has on more that suppression and repair side of the world. Most of Pete's research has been on the bear treatment effectiveness and salvage, but it's off the top of my mind, I don't know of any research ongoing for the suppression and repair activities.
Okay. I'm in the same boat, Kara. I don't know either.
I think it sort of highlights the some of these areas are they're important, but they haven't been studied, and so we have to use sort of adaptive management. Please feel free to unmute or add other questions in the chat window. We got another couple of minutes, and for anybody who joined late, we will be recording this session and sharing it with registrants, etc. Oh, good. So Mary Ellen added some information on VIIRS. Yeah, I think this is a good example. Everything from water bars on fire line to satellites, from the sort of dirt to space is relevant as we think about post-fire environments.
Xander, this is Mike Zupko. Wanted to mention something, go back to something that was talked about a little bit earlier in, and I might should have jumped in, but I had my camera off, so I didn't. Anyhow, conversation about being able to work off of federal land onto private land or non-federal land and vice versa. And the EWP program was mentioned earlier. I will say, you know, we've had a small group kind of working on working closely with NRCS on, you know, efficiencies in that program. And one of the unique things that we've learned about, and I think folks will know this inherently, oftentimes if there's a fire on federal land, it may or may not reach onto non-federal land, but the impacts of what happened post-fire on that federal land can more heavily impact the non-federal land. So I'm sure some folks can maybe correct in how I describe all this, but we've built some relationships, and I think we might have some unique opportunities coming up to actually be able to use EWP funds on federal land, but for the protection of non-federal assets. So some unique things there. I think that's kind of built over time with some relationships within NRCS that I know the Forest Service is invested in, but just wanted to mention that. And I don't know if any of the panelists want to add anything to that comment.
I can just add a little in that we are looking at piloting a couple of different projects for the 2020 fire season on some fires that have that exact situation. that we didn't have any post-fire emergencies, in particular needing special treatments on the federal lands, but there are the private lands downstream that do need some treatments for protection, especially with some of the water providers and municipal watersheds. So we're looking at piloting a couple of projects to create some templates for how we can put those agreements in place to make sure that we're having that better community response from the USDA perspective.
That's great. That's really heartening to hear about that kind of cross-jurisdictional thinking and making funding work the way we'd like to think. Another comment or question came in from Randy. Any thoughts on how to address the differences in post-fire treatments on DOI, for example, Bureau of Land Management lands and Forest Service lands? Does BLM have ES&R available where Forest Service does bear and hopefully can find funding to do additional treatments such as seeding? How do we address this with our publics?
So I can jump in again. It's we recently got some new direction from the Congress Appropriations Committees for the Forest Service to develop a plan of what that rehabilitation program on the Forest Service would look like to be a sister program to what the DOI has with the rehabilitation program. So we are in the midst of working on developing that for hopefully implementation next fiscal year. We'll have to see if our response back is what's needed, and we're actively working with DOI to try to get some consistency with both programs, both the emergency and the rehabilitation, with updating all of the agency handbooks and direction to try to get on the same page. So we're working on it. That's our answer for everything right now.
This is Mike, I'll just add to that a little bit. We have somewhat socialized that within the WFLIC principles. And I think what Kara just described is pretty exciting, that there's some structure to it. Hopefully we can continue to socialize that within the principles, not just within federal, but state, local, and tribal, to support that and hopefully continue to generate that. But I think that's a great question, Randy. That's obviously been a challenge for the Forest Service for a while.
Great, and maybe that's a good optimistic note to wrap things up on. I'll take the opportunity to thank all the panelists. Anne, do you have any last words?
No, other than just thank you so much, and for your participation, everyone. Just know that there are a lot of people thinking and working on this at a big scale as well as the local scale that a lot of people on the phone are more familiar with. So expect more to come.
Great. Well, thanks again, everybody. And we'll go ahead and end the webinar, but look forward to having you on future events.